I was wanting to respond to the question that was posed for this session, which is, what does human-centered algorithmic governance look like in practice? And I think what I'm going to be talking about is more on the question of the human in human-centered governance rather than the what does it look like in practice side of things. So in some ways, it sounds like quite a straightforward question, but as an anthropologist, I find this question quite confusing. And I think anthropology is a discipline that's inherently human-centered. So in some ways, we should be in a really good position to be able to respond to this question of what does a human-centered form of governance look like. But on the other hand, anthropology is also a discipline that is all about the massive variety in different ways that exist around the world in different times, different places, of actually being human. So one of the things that as an anthropologist we would look at is how we can kind of bring into view marginalized or everyday kind of understandings of what it means to be human. But also, how can we address and understand the way that experts and kind of expert practices also produce very specific and historically specific forms of understanding what it means to be human or to represent or speak on behalf of the human. So I thought maybe I would spend this 5 minutes just sort of exploring that issue a bit more and thinking about how that could contribute to the discussions about human-centered algorithmic governance and what we actually mean when we're talking about human-centered algorithmic governance. So I'm going to talk about a kind of few examples of the way that kind of literature on governance in anthropology and other social sciences have addressed and thought about the human in different contexts, and thought about the way that the tools and technologies and techniques of governance have produced particular kinds of understandings of the human that I think are at play in algorithmic governance, but also being reworked by algorithms as well. And I'll give some examples, I think, from some of the research that I've been doing over the past few years, which has been around the governance of climate change and energy, but with a kind of focus on technologies and tools that are used in that space. So the first version of the human that I want to touch on, which has been talked about and written about a lot in the context of questions around what does it mean to govern the human, is the idea of the human as homo economicus. So this is the idea of the human being as an object or subject of governance that assumes that what makes us human is our capacity for kind of rational evaluation of problems and the weighing up of different kinds of different kinds of data in order to make decisions about how we live our lives. So one of the effects of the kind of approach of governance that puts on the table the subject who's being governed as homo economicus is that when that goes out into the world, one of the things that it often produces is a sense that actually the world is full of all these kind of irrational subjects who are not operating or working within the form that it's assumed that they should be operating or working within. So to give an example from some of the research that I've been doing over the past few years, there was an initiative that was rolled out a few years ago called the Green New Deal, and this was an attempt to encourage people to take out loans to put insulation in their houses. And it was very much kind of articulated and argued on the basis that of homo economicus, that it would be a financial benefit for people to put insulation in their homes. And there was quite a lot of kind of consternation when this policy failed. But one thing that was kind of, I thought was very, very interesting about this was, whilst there were a lot of critiques of the idea that people would take out loans to put insulation in their own homes, even similar schemes where people were being given insulation for free to improve the quality of their own homes and reduce their bills were also not being taken up in the way that people were expecting. So we had this sort of open this question up of the relationship between the way that policymakers were thinking about what motivates people and why they do what they do, and then a kind of juxtaposition with how people actually act every day. The second area of kind of thinking about the human in the context of governance that I wanted to put on the table was another sort of idea of the human, which is almost kind of comes in contrast to Homo economicus, which is the idea not that people are rational actors who are weighing up decisions or weighing up data and making kind of rational decisions on the basis of that, but one that sees people as moved by kind of affective responses to their environment that they don't even notice is happening to them. So it's very much a kind of behavioralist understanding of the human, often phrased under the kind of banner of kind of nudge theory. And here, the actions of people are kind of the forms of governmental intervention are often kind of derived from psychological analyses of how people respond in particular circumstances to certain kinds of triggers as a way of manipulating people to act in one particular way or another particular kind of way. So, like Homo economicus, this kind of nudge form of governance also, of course, comes into contact with people in all kinds of circumstances. And one of the effects of this behaviorist understanding of the human is that it can be kind of understood as rather manipulative. It can reduce the sense that people have any kind of agency themselves, and it can be seen as well as anti-democratic, so kind of intervening into social spaces without giving people a right to respond to those forms of intervention or a right of reply into these kinds of interventions. So these are a couple of kind of areas where there's been a lot of people have written about these topics. And I think these are both at play when we come to thinking about algorithms. But I think there's also an interesting question about whether there are particular kind of understandings of humans and human being that are now being put on the table through the kinds of algorithms that we're talking about in today's meeting. So one way, for example, that we might see algorithms as affecting people is by understanding the person not as an individual who is making choices about the world or somebody to be nudged, but as a compilation of probabilities that is projected forward into the future. So a lot of the work on algorithmic governance is about how to govern a version of the person that doesn't necessarily align very well with a particular individual in a particular kind of place, but is a kind of compilation of aggregated data, and is also about thinking about human beings as entities that haven't yet manifested the thing that they're going to manifest in the future. And I remember doing some research with which Jenny, who's also on this panel, was involved in as well, which was working with a local authority on the use of algorithms and predictive data in the context of kind of public interventions, particularly working with social workers. And one of the things that the social workers found frustrating about the algorithm was that their whole rationale of what they were trying to do in their work was actually change people's outcomes. But algorithms which were being deployed to identify the risks of particular people they were working with either not paying their rent or defaulting on payments or having kind of effects in the future, completely didn't deal with the interventions that they were actually making as social workers. So there was a sort of challenge there, a kind of rupture there in the way that an algorithmic understanding of the person or the human was being juxtaposed with already existing understandings about what the person as a subject of social work actually was and what we could expect them to do. So really that's all I wanted to say, to put on the table that maybe when we talk about human-centered algorithmic governance, we need to just pause and think about who's human, what kind of human is being invoked and implied by the appeal to being human-centered.